The National Assembly has had to compete for power with the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly is dedicated to writing a brand new constitution for Venezuela. The National Assembly, they ceded a lot of powers to Maduro 5 years ago, and they should regret it now. So Congress in the United States ceded a shit ton of power to President Bush in 2001. In fact, all the war powers were ceded. So we've had a war dictator in this country since 2001. Now, you have two main characters, okay? So I'm going to try to put this as simply as I can. There, you have two main characters. You got Nikolas Maduro, who's the president of Venezuela. He's been the president for the last 5 years, and he's just now starting his second term. So he's going to be in there for probably another 5 years if, you know, all this goes his way. Now, he did this Constituent Assembly. They butted heads with the National Assembly. National Assembly is the parliament, it's the Congress, it's the legislative body, it's unicameral. So, not like America, there's not two houses. So, if you're to put Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi together, you would get Juan Guaido. So, you got Juan Guaido and you got Nikolas Maduro. You got Juan Guaido and Nikolas Maduro. Nikolas Maduro is the president, and Juan Guaido is the leader of the legislative branch. He's the leader of the National Assembly. So he's not I think they call it the president. There's mayors and, you know, city managers, they call it presidents of cities. That doesn't mean, you know, there's presidents of companies. You know, if you're president of G and E, that doesn't make you president of the world. Oh, hey, I'm the president, right? So he's got the title president, but that's because he's the leader of the legislative branch, just like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. So to see if things are fair, all you got to do is just reverse the roles. So if Venezuela came into the United States and they, you know, this is what we're about to do, right? We're about to invade and then go ahead and install the person we think is correct. So if Venezuela was threatening to install Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi into the presidency, declaring Donald Trump illegitimate and putting the head of the legislative branch in charge, that would be the, you know, that'd be the same thing of what we're about to do. So that's, what the fuck? Would you agree with that? You know, some people, you know, would like Chuck Schumer better. So is that good? Do we need Venezuela to decide our affairs for us? Do we need to wait for, you know, big, you know, nice Venezuela to come help us, to come save us from our dictator? So Donald Trump is being a hypocrite. If Donald Trump doesn't want, you know, for the Venezuelan people to do the same shit to him, I guess right now we're just in the negotiation phase. So it would be like if Donald Trump declared himself dictator and then Chuck Schumer went to Venezuela, and then Venezuela says, hey, we got your president. No, America, you're wrong. No, your president is Chuck Schumer. Nah, I know he's ran out and he's gone. So here's who's backing who, okay? So you have a lot of countries, a lot of nations, a lot of people. People are dividing over this shit. And it's interesting how this is breaking down. So on matters of war and peace, let's just talk about the presidential candidates. On matters of war and peace, Tulsi Gabbard has got it down. Tulsi Gabbard is the only person that's speaking out against this attempted coup d'etat against Venezuela. Venezuela is giving us that 72 hour red line in the sand, so I think they're going to go in there, either arrest the diplomats or deport the diplomats, right? And it's their country. They would have a right to do that, but the Civil War started with the attack on a federal fort, so if the Venezuelan people went into our embassy, is that a pretense for war? Is that a pretense for war? Because why doesn't the United States ever have a coup d'etat? Because we don't have a U.S. embassy. The coup d'etats come out of the U.S. embassies. So out of, Kamala Harris, out of Kirsten Gillibrand, out of Beto O'Rourke, out of Elizabeth Warren or Cory Booker or Sherrod Brown, or that Andrew Yang with the UBI, Andrew Yang might take us. I only got two choices for president now. Ojeda is right that you got to, be tough when you run, but my champion is Tulsi Gabbard and that UBI guy. And even if you don't think Tulsi's going to be a president, if Bernie Sanders is elected, she's going to be an important part of Bernie's administration. So get your head out of your asses. The people that run for president, they get all these cushy, cozy jobs. They get into the administration. They go somewhere. At the very least, they control the narrative. And if they're able to use their position to run for, as running for president as leverage, then they could get themselves a nice, cushy government job. So to think that Tulsi Gabbard, may become vice president under Bernie Sanders if she don't win the Democratic primary, that is, that's less, that's more believable than her taking all of it. But she's old enough, and she'd be a badass. She'd be the greatest fucking thing America. You want to make great America greater? Then elect Tulsi Gabbard. So Kamala Harris didn't say shit. Beto O'Rourke didn't say shit. Kirsten Gillibrand didn't say shit. Elizabeth Warren didn't say shit. Cory Booker didn't say shit. Sherrod Brown didn't say shit. And then Bernie Sanders, his was ambiguous. What he said was, ambiguous. So there's two different ways. So essentially he did say we need to stay out of the South and Central American countries. We've been toppling socialist regimes based on their economics for decades. So he says we don't need to follow that history. Whereas Tulsi Gabbard says the United States needs to stay out of Venezuela, period. Fucking 7 sentences. Done. The U.S. stay out of Venezuela. And that's correct. That's absolutely right. So Bernie Sanders, he said that Venezuela has been waging a violent crackdown on Venezuelan civil society, violated the Constitution by dissolving the National Assembly, and was reelected in an election that some said were fraudulent. So he said, one thing, he's talking out of both ends of his mouth. He's sitting there saying that, there may be a case to intervene, but we shouldn't intervene. Whereas Tulsi Gabbard says, stay the fuck out of Venezuela. Stay the fuck out of Venezuela. So who's on, which side, who's on, what powers does Nikolas Maduro have versus Juan Guaido? You can't just pick a person out of the crowd, right? You can't just say, hey, you're the president. But that's what Donald's doing. Nikolas Maduro controls 3 of the 4 branches of government because they have an election branch of government. So he controls 3 of the 4 branches of government, but Juan Guaido has 1 branch, the National Assembly. So who is for the U.S.? Who's on our side, our fucking government side? Who's on the wrong fucking side of history? Well, the UK, of course. Canada, which is shocking. You also got France, Brazil, Colombia, Peru. These are right-wing governments. France, neoliberal runs. France, neoliberal runs Canada. So Brazil, Colombia, Peru, right-wingers. In fact, Hitler, they've been calling the leader of Brazil the new Hitler. So the Argentinians, the Brazilians, the Canadians, the governments of Colombia, Ecuador, Germany, Peru, UK, US have all picked the side of Juan Guaido. So that's, actually Germany said something ambiguous. And then Ecuador and Peru, that's what I got written down, so I'm going to go with it. Rejected by the Supreme Tribunal of Justice. So Juan Guaido, he says he's the president, but the Supreme Court of Venezuela says, no, you're not. So what would we do if that happened, right? What we did is we listened to the Supreme Court. Bush v. Gore. Supreme Court says no new recount. Bush is the president. The Supreme Court of Venezuela says that Maduro is the president. Who's all on the side of Nikolas Maduro? Well, there's Syria. Now, Ecuador. Okay, I see Ecuador 2 times on this list. So which side are you on, Ecuador? Nicaragua, Cuba, China, Iran, Russia, Turkey, Mexico, Bolivia. He's got the military, the National Electoral Council, the Supreme Court. He's got the oil company, the PDVSA, the Venezuela Oil Company. And he's got all the Chavistas. He's got all those gangs. So China is on Venezuela's side. Russia is on Venezuela, Maduro's side. Cuba, Iran, Turkey, Mexico, Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Syria. So, that's not the greatest, but China, Russia did some big ones. Cuba, they're socialist buddies there. So Mexico, that's an interesting one. Canada's on one side, Mexico's on the other. So, yeah, countries are lining up on one side or the other. Now, Nikolas Maduro, he is in the right. I don't think that Americans would appreciate Venezuela, whether you like Trump or not, but if he was to kidnap, coup d'etat this government and then install Chuck Schumer as the new president, some people would probably like that because that's the result that they want. But you can't say that the process is acceptable. And that's what we got to do with these countries. We got to treat other countries as we want to be treated ourselves. The biggest problem with Venezuela is that they're a socialist nation, so they, basically by their socialist antics make a mockery of capitalist Yankees. And then the other problem is that they have a shit ton of oil underneath them. So we want that oil, right? We want all the oil. We just go ahead and conquer countries for oil. Oil is our life force. We're addicted to oil. Now, Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, he's been the Secretary General since May 2015. He has sided against Maduro. So the Organization of American States was established in 1948. The headquarters is in D.C., and there's 35 individual states of the Americas. Essentially, all the states of Americas are in this Organization of American States. The OAS approved a resolution declaring Maduro as illegitimate. So the OAS is against Maduro, right? So the OAS is with France and Peru and Colombia and Brazil. But the European Union and the Germans said that the Parliament has the most important role. So the Germans didn't pick a side. They just said, Parliament, the National Assembly, you got a very special role in this. You can, essentially bring all the parties together if you're able, if you can. He's, Juan Guaido is 35 years old. Can a 35-year-old get all the opposition parties together? So that's what the Germans said. So they were actually neutral. The European Union says we need new elections, but they didn't recognize Juan Guaido as the new president. So the European Union didn't pick a side either. So they were neutral. They called for new elections. And I think that's a good idea. I think new elections would be a good idea. Have the United Nations or some, Venezuela or some, third party, non-biased third party to run their elections so that there's no intimidation. There's intimidation in the United States. There's lots of problems. The United States does not have any moral superiority when it comes to how much better our democracy is. They have 4 branches of government, so if anything, they got, another check on their dictator. We only got 3 branches to check our dictator. I want to talk about the structure of the government, okay? So that's who's on whose side. And that's what the presidential candidate had said. Now, for the final piece of this, the structure of the government. How is Venezuela constructed, right? They're a democracy. They had elections. The president of Venezuela is both the head of government and state, just like the U.S. They're elected by direct universal elections, just like the U.S. Anybody 18 years of age is of voting age. Voting is not compulsory, not mandatory, so just like the U.S., the term of office is 6 years. Excuse me, I've been saying 5. So the term of the presidential office is 6 years. Maduro just got out of his first term. He's now entering his second term, and he can be reelected an unlimited amount of times. Juan Guaido is the head of the legislative body. The legislative body is just a unicameral government. It's their parliament. It's their Congress. But instead of having a Senate and a House of Representatives, they just have one single National Assembly that's filled with 165 members. The Constituent Assembly had 500 to 600 members. So the National Assembly, by numbers, there's only 165 members in the National Assembly, and there's about 500 or 600 in the Constituent Assembly. Just by the numbers, the Constituent Assembly has more people. So there are 5-year terms for the National Assembly. So Juan Guaido, when he got elected to the National Assembly, gets a 5-year term. There's only one representative, for their Congress instead of 2. So you have Chuck and Nancy Pelosi, who controls the legislative branch in the U.S., but only Juan Guaido runs the legislative branch in Venezuela. So Juan Guaido is the Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi combined into one person of Venezuela. That's who he is. It's, is on the pecking order in the 3 branches. So, yeah. Nikolas Maduro has warned 72 hours for the diplomats to get out of Venezuela. The reason we haven't been coup d'etat here is because we don't have a U.S. embassy here. The Supreme Tribunal of Justice is their Supreme Court. So they got a presidency, they got a Congress, and they have a Supreme Court. They also have a National Electoral Council. So they got 4 branches of government. And they got a military, and I'm not exactly sure how their military works, if they're independent or not. I'd assume not. So Venezuela's got 4 branches of government, whereas the U.S. only has 3 branches of government. Maduro controls 3 of the 4 branches. Maduro's side is the Supreme Court and the military. He's got his own presidency. He's got the executive branch. He's got the judicial branch. He's got the election branch and the military branch. So he's got 3 or 4 branches on his side, and Juan Guaido controls the National Assembly. So the National Assembly is the only thing that's out of Maduro's hands. The Supreme Court, the magistrates are elected by Parliament for single 2-year terms. So it's not like America. The Supreme Court, once they're appointed by the Senate and the President, Senate nominates President, the President nominates Senate, says yes, or whatever, some fancy term that says yes, you can be the Supreme Court Justice. So once you become a Supreme Court Justice in the United States, you're a Supreme Court Justice for life. You got a job for life until you die or just quit. So the Supreme Court Justices, the reason why the U.S. did that, why our founding fathers had lifetime appointments for the Supreme Court, was so that they're not swayed by popular opinion. So they will go ahead and judge cases based upon their merits, not based upon the whims, of the times. So, but their Supreme Court doesn't have lifetime appointments, so they can be, they can be swayed here and there and everywhere. In fact, Maduro had just replaced all the Supreme Court. I think there's 5 justices. They call them magistrates. So there's 5 magistrates, and they're elected by Parliament for just 2-year terms. 1 single 2-year terms. So even if you're able to get elected to the Supreme Court, then you'll have to, by Parliament. Parliament has to elect you. So if somehow you knew the people that's in power and you're able to put yourself, you only get a position for 2 years. So that's not job security, and they will sway with the times. But Maduro actually just went ahead and knocked the Supreme Court out and said, we're going to go ahead and get a new Supreme Court in here after the National Assembly was a bunch of anti-Maduro people. So the National Electoral Council, the 4th branch of Venezuela, is formed by 5 directors elected by the National Assembly, their parliament, their Congress. So the National Assembly has a ton of power. The National Assembly gets to pick who directs the National Electoral Council. The National Assembly are the ones who gets to pick the Supreme Court. Well, I guess up until he went ahead and replaced the Supreme Court himself. So that seems a little fishy. You can't just change the entire Supreme Court. But, unless I'm there on the ground and I know specifically how all these mechanisms work, I feel like even the sort of doubtful, the asterisks by Nikolas Maduro, what he, had a constitutional convention first before consulting the National Assembly, and that's illegal. That's fuck off. That's the bullshit. That's just, people being anti-Maduro because they don't like his socialist policies. But if, ultimately, what I think about Venezuela is that the United States shouldn't meddle. We have no business being in any other countries. They're not attacking us. They're not going to invade us. We're under no threat whatsoever. We just want to make sure Nikolas Maduro doesn't control the country for the next 6 years. So this is a desperate move for us to intervene into their internal politics. We had the same internal politics when the birth of this country between the Articles of Confederation and the Continental Congress government versus George Washington's government under the Constitutional Convention. So we've had 2 constitutions. We had the new Constitution dissolved the old government. So once the new Constitution was written, then the old government was no more. But don't think that just because you dissolve the old government that those same people won't get into the new government, only in a different form. So it's not like you're losing your job. You just have to, read the Constitution and see where you're supposed to be in this new leadership, in this new government that's being created. So Maduro's got some power. He's got the Supreme Court, which he went ahead and appointed himself. He's got the National Electoral Council, which that's amazing since the National Assembly had to appoint those 5 directors. The military, he basically bribes the military. So there's nobody more loyal than paid staff. So I think the military is going to be in Nicolas Maduro's pocket the entire time. So if we invade Venezuela, which is what I feel the rhetoric is talking about, if we invade Venezuela in Operation Restoring Democracy, then we're going to have to fight against the military. We're going to have to fight against Maduro in the Supreme Court. So I don't say that Nicolas Maduro doesn't have a slam dunk case. He's not just minding his own business. He seems like he's a dictator, but if that's the dictator the people of Venezuela want, it's their business. Let them figure all this shit out. This has ebbs and flows to it. So whereas I can't say Nicolas Maduro is absolutely perfect, he's done everything perfect and right, I also don't think he's done enough stuff that warrants an invasion. So I believe that the battle will come down to the Constituent Assembly and the National Assembly. That's where the power struggle is at. And then these elections, apparently because there's 2 sides, it's almost like a civil war there, that perhaps somebody should just help run new elections. Let's just do what the European Union says. Let's get some new elections in there. This is a shit show. This is a fucking mess. The United States has no business toppling governments and installing puppets. The whole world will see that we're doing this. I don't see how Venezuela could, tolerate another nation doing that to them. I wouldn't be against, why don't we give Venezuela a referendum? See if they want to become the 51st state. Puerto Rico does. 80% of Puerto Ricans voted to become a U.S. state before Hurricane Maria wiped out 3,000 of them. Hurricane Maria was the 9/11 of Puerto Rico. 3,000 died in little tiny island of Puerto Rico. Well, when 3,000 died in the United States, that was like a huge fucking deal now, wasn't it? So Puerto Rico voted to be a state. So instead of invading nations, I think we should reach out with referendums and increase our 50 states to 100 states. Hell, maybe the Americas would love to be one fucking nation. Maybe we could unite the 2, North and South America into one nation. Maybe the countries would love that. Maybe they're not nationalistic. Maybe they're, we're part of the New World, right? This New World experiment. What the fuck we doing conquering the Middle East? I'm never going to go to the Middle East. Most of y'all ain't going to go to the Middle East. So referendums, if you could get a referendum of a nation that wants to become our state, then we've conquered that state without firing a shot. So, yeah, the morality of it, the internal politics, it's a constituent assembly. They're writing a constitution. They're going to dissolve the National Assembly. The National Assembly is jealous, and they want to preserve themselves. And so this is a last-ditch, desperate act. But the National Assembly is going to be needed to implement the new Constitution, and up until the point of the new government, they'll be useful up until the point of the new government. And who's to say that those same members can't get into the new government that's elected after the new Constitution? And the Constitution has to be, there needs to be a referendum. So the people, I don't even know if the Constitution has been written. I haven't heard about this Constituent Assembly since they, established themselves. But they're supposed to write a constitution, and then they were supposed to have a referendum. So once the people vote on that constitution, either you get a brand new government, or you get the same old government. If you get the same old government, the National Assembly has nothing to worry about. But if they're just worried about keeping their jobs, then read the fucking Constitution and figure out how you're going to get into the new government. And then also implement the new government, implement the Constitution, implement the elections, the referendum to vote on the Constitution. So the National Assembly, this is a very desperate move. So I feel like they're kind of showing their ass. They're showing that they're very weak. And instead of implementing, this thing, they could have done it fairly. We never undo any of our elections in America. We do not, if the opposition boycotted, most Americans don't vote in America anyway. So actually, the opposition, the American people don't participate in their own democracy. So yeah, we have no moral superiority about how our democracy is, you know, how our democracy works better. We're not morally superior to the Venezuelan people at all. All right, peace.